So I have to start by saying that I'm a little bit of an interloper here. I'm not an expert in the area of solar or even renewable energy or environmentalism. I do spend most of my time talking about the economic reforms in China. And because I'm very interested in issues of industry development and the ways in which China is in some ways actually planning what we actually are doing in a lot of different areas. One of the areas that comes up is renewable energy. So I wanted to come talk to you all today a little bit about how we can be thinking about issues of renewable energy, how we can think about where our strengths and weaknesses are, and how we might actually even be able to learn from China in ways that many people often don't expect we can. Okay, so I'm going to just jump in here and then see where we go. Now, I usually like to start this conversation by talking about a case that was in the news probably 3 or 4 months ago. I guess it was in December that Evergreen Solar announced that they were closing up shop in Massachusetts and heading to the Far East. Now, this was a particularly, I'm sure many of you know this case, but this was a particularly great chagrin for the Massachusetts government, because the Massachusetts government had actually invested a significant amount in terms of tax credits and a number of other incentives for Evergreen Solar to build its photovoltaic film plant there. And this is, of course, an issue that we think about a lot because many people talk about the fact that renewable energy is the next great phase of innovation and development. And so the story I'm going to tell is not the one that was reported in the press. The one that was reported in the press was that this was another case of the evil China stealing our jobs. But the story I'm going to tell is a little bit of a different one, and in some ways a much more critical one, which is that this is not a case of the evil China stealing our jobs. This is a case of the fact that the largest communist society in the world is a much more business-friendly and much more dynamic capitalist economy than the largest capitalist economy in the world. That's true. And that's actually, to my mind, one of the great things that terrifies me about where our economy is going right now is because we are not operating in a business-friendly environment anymore. And so there's a couple of pieces to that puzzle, and so I'm going to talk through what my views on that are. So let me just dive right into China, okay? And this is just a very short background piece. Everybody here knows this basic story. This is the story of a backwater third world developing economy on the brink of bankruptcy in 1979 that has emerged to be the second largest economy in the world and is still growing at about 8% per year in GDP. And so it's just everybody knows that piece of the puzzle. In some ways, though, that piece of the puzzle can only be supplanted or only be passed if you've spent time there. So I was just in China last week. I was out at the Suzhou Industrial Park. Everybody knows what's going on in Shanghai and Beijing, but if you go to these pockets of tier 2 cities throughout China, the story is unbelievable. The story is so much more about true innovation in institutional development and true deep thought about how you build a viable and vibrant capitalist economy. Now, people have many images of China. It was not that many years ago that students would still think that China was a place where people were wearing communist suits and Mao hats. Of course, those visions have gone away today, but we still have these notions of China that are really about a communist authoritarian state that is so dominant in controlling energy or controlling information and controlling content that it's just not a place to actually think about dynamic freedom and dynamic capitalism. But these two things actually do work together in interesting ways, and how they work together really began in 1979. Deng Xiaoping, for all of his totalitarian tendencies, was an amazing pragmatist. And he was an individual that actually completely understood where the future of China was. And in 1979, January of that year, he came to visit Jimmy Carter, and signed the normalization agreement, and he began by opening his doors to major companies like Coca-Cola and Boeing, and spending some time at NASA, because he actually understood where the future was. The world changed once again, however, in 2001. As a China scholar watching this, we were sort of tracking what was actually going on in terms of the pulse of how businesses were viewing China, what China's growing power was in the global economy. And the moment of 2001, I think, is just such a remarkable moment if you were paying attention during that time. And of course, in 2008, we saw the greatest coming out party we've ever seen of the nation. And from there, it's just been gangbusters. And China has really kind of, in many ways, set itself in a position of very much equaling the United States on the geopolitical power stage. So let me zero in then on this issue of renewable energy, because it is no secret, and many people have the opinion, that China is rapidly moving ahead, not just of the United States, but of Europe as well, in the area of renewable energy. And so there's an interesting question as to why, especially when a lot of that technology is developed here. Why is it that China's depth in this area is becoming such a powerhouse to contend with economically? One of the reasons that's interesting here is the constant rejoinder that what China is doing in terms of the development of this industry is unfair capitalist practice. Right? So a suit was filed in September of last year by the United States Steelworkers, which basically said, by WTO standards, what China is doing is completely unfair. It boils down to unfair market practices, mainly because the state is subsidizing and investing in this industry. And there's no doubt about that. The government is fundamentally investing in the industry. But what I'm going to make the case for here is that almost all major industries that have become powerhouse industries have had some level of help from the government, whether it's hidden or upfront subsidization. And this is just smart capitalism. This is actually the way you have to build a capitalist economy, and this is why we're losing. So let me just talk through a little bit of how that's actually happened. So in the United States, when we want to think about kind of either the history of solar energy or even just more generally how the government actually pushes organizations or pushes industries like this forward, we usually think of major symbolic acts, right? So I'm sure everybody remembers in Jimmy Carter's term when he actually had this big high-profile effort to put solar panels on the White House compound. They were taken off later by George Bush. Obama put them back. And Obama has talked about these issues of doing big things. Actually, really thinking about his most recent State of the Union speech was about the we do big things. We talked about renewable energy and building in this area. But talk is cheap. The reality is that building industries, particularly industries that are based on procurement, and particularly industries that the world is uncertain of what the market is for, of what the market for the product is, it takes time to actually stabilize those industries. And usually it's more time than venture capitalists alone are willing to bear. So one of the things we see here is that, yes, China is speeding ahead, but it's because China is aggressively investing in these industries. It's particularly interesting because if you look at what the investment has been just in recent years, just last year, was a $30+ billion investment in this area. But they also have a number of companies like English Solar that has become a powerhouse in this industry. Now, English Solar is an interesting company as well, because even though it's a publicly traded firm on the New York Stock Exchange, this is a company that is fundamentally controlled by the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, which makes some investors nervous. In my mind, if you want to co-invest with China, SASIC is your best bet. SASIC is a good asset management company. They're a state-owned asset management company, but they are the people who really think deeply about industry development. They also think about what they want to put forward. I thought it was particularly poignant from my perspective that in the World Cup, China was marketing renewable energy. We were marketing McDonald's. So let me just tell you two quick stories. One of them I've already mentioned, but another is a story about how this actually happened. So not long ago, I was talking with Chad Holliday, who I'm sure many of you know, who was the chairman and CEO of DuPont. We were talking about these issues, and I was expressing the concern over where the U.S. economy is going, and in particular, we were talking about everything solar. And he said, let me tell you a story that's actually very parallel to that. He said, I was towards the end of my career at DuPont. I was thinking about doing the final deal. We were going to build a photovoltaic dome plant. We didn't know where to build it. Frankly, if I would have wanted to build it in the United States to help jobs and help the industry, I wouldn't have known who to call, actually, because just the outreach from the government in terms of deals that we could get is just not as aggressive as the parties. China and Singapore heard that we were in the market for a new plant. They came after us. A bidding war ensued. And then eventually we started building this plant in Guangdong. Now, of course, this was about 2007. 2008, they had massive plans in place, and the world economy goes crisis. And so Chad called up the people in Guangdong and said, I think we need to scale back. I think that this is just, we're a little bit worried about it. They said, what would it take for you to not scale back? I said, well, guaranteed procurement would be nice. And the Chinese said, it's done. Don't even worry about it. So that's the friendly business environment piece for building an industry. Now, there's also the unfriendly business environment piece that I think we cannot forget. And we need to, sometimes when I give this talk or talk about things like this, people perceive it as very un-American. People think I'm so critical of the American government and how can you talk about the U.S. this way? And my view is that this is the most patriotic thing I can do. We have to actually sit down and think about what's wrong with our economy. And our economy is fundamentally missing things like cross-industry strategization, serious investment in industry from the government. And so I think actually we really need to think deeply about this. So let's go back to the case of Evergreen Solar for a minute. So Evergreen Solar, they did have this very nice deal from the state of Massachusetts. They did have a lot of support, and there was a lot of fanfare. But they also had about 1/7 or 1/8 of their bondage issues tied up in Lehman Brothers bonds. Right? So when Lehman went under, they lost a huge amount of their capital that they were actually going to be relying on in a very, very low margin business, right? Low margin and unpredictable. So, of course, first thing they did is they went to the federal government and said, well, can we get TARP money? Because, our guys went under, it seems like we should get some of this benefit. The government said, well, you're not a financial institution, you can't get TARP money. Can we get some help, guaranteed federal loan? No, we don't do that. The TARP money is all gone to the banks. Now, the banks at the time were basically sitting on cash, but not wanting to actually lend it because they themselves were trying to figure out their stability. So eventually, Evergreen had a choice. Either we shut our doors and go out of business, or we go to a place that's going to offer us a better deal. And so, in my mind, what we have to really be thinking about here is how we can actually push the economy forward and push this industry forward. And it's not going to happen from tax credits alone. And I think China's a good lesson in that. Now, there are some good stories here. The city of Chicago on the south side recently built a huge photovoltaic array plant that I think is a really interesting case. And so it's not all bad news. But I think these kinds of things have to be at the heart of what we're trying to do to push the economy forward, to push this industry forward. Now, I just want to take a couple of minutes to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive on China, because I think that the story is one that's really interesting and it's one that's not often told about how the economy has evolved this way. So in my work, I tend to focus on 5 key points. I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. I'm going to talk about gradualism, decentralization, and foreign direct investment. And I think that these, in my mind, are all issues, parallel issues that we can draw on and use and understand better in the U.S. economy. And one of the key features of China's economic reform process, and it's one that contrasts very greatly with our economic development processes in the U.S., is that it is fundamentally indeterminate. Right? So that's actually one of the key things. People think of this, that China as being ideologically driven and us being perhaps ideologically driven, but we're capitalist ideologically driven. But the big thing that gives China an advantage is that everything that they do economically is indeterminate. It's all based on the concept of gradualism. Deng Xiaoping actually coined a term that he used to say over and over again, that their economic system was about what he called groping for stones to cross the river, which means essentially you're feeling your way across this river. You know on the other side of that lies great economic prominence and maybe world dominance, But you don't know how you're going to get there until you actually see how the institutions and how the industries are working, right? So each step is a little bit of feeling your way across this torrent, right? On the other hand, from our perspective, I think we're often driven by this notion that there are certain core tenets of how a capitalist economy works, and we should just adhere to those tenets and everything will be fine. Governments are bad, the private sector is good. Investment in industry needs to come from venture capital. Any role that the government plays is just an overreaching of its mandate, etc. But I think the key thing that we need to learn here is that experimenting with new industries and creating a stable environment in which there is a relationship between the public and private sectors, I think is really the key to why China has been so successful. There's a second piece of this, though, that is crucial. One of the things that confused a lot of economists in the late 80s and early 90s was this question of how could it be that China's economic reform had been so successful, even at that point, if they weren't following the mandate or the prescription of the World Bank and the IMF, that in order to build a capitalist economy, you have to rapidly privatize property. That's what Russia did. Several of other European nations did this in different ways. And China said, no, we're not doing that. So there was a bunch of economists, mostly led by Jeffrey Sachs and Wing Tai Wu, who were saying, well, they must be lying. Surely there is privatization going on here. So that's really what's happening. But the key feature of this was decentralization. Decentralization and local competition are the key features of what has made China's economic reform so successful. And I would contend that, actually for me, as somebody who studies economic development and argues with economists about this issue a lot, they've actually in many ways pushed forward a key revision of what we think of as the core capitalist economy. I would argue that private property has nothing to do with it. Competition and accountability has everything to do with it. And we know this in terms of some of our own firms. GM was not a government-owned enterprise, a state-owned enterprise, and it was wildly inefficient. Right? When you introduce accountability, it becomes a little different. Interestingly, for GM, the most efficient part of their operations was their operations in Shanghai, which were a joint venture with the Shanghai Automotive Industrial Corporation, which is a state-owned company. So I think that in many cases, these issues are really the fundamental tenet of what we need to do to build an economy. Back to China, though. In the case of China, it's a massively decentralized system, and you have incredible competition amongst localities. So for those just on a specific note who are interested in being in China, investing in China, and thinking about China, the note I always return to is that you have to understand that China is not China. China is a conglomeration of 31 provinces and municipalities with hundreds and hundreds of very viable municipalities that are very, very effective at competing for foreign direct investment. And it makes for all kinds of business-friendly practices that they engage in. I'm a big advocate, by the way, of the second-tier city phenomenon. I think if you're spending time in China and you're going to Shanghai and Beijing, you're missing what's going on in China. It has very little to do with it anymore. Sort of the officials in Shanghai and Beijing don't like to hear that, but I think it's true. So there's many other places that are going. But let me tell you a little quick side story of this to give you a sense of just how well things work and why they're driven so much by this competition. The case of Suzhou. So Suzhou is in Jiangsu province. Suzhou and Wuxi have become the two main places for the development of renewable energy and in particular solar technology. Now, how have they become so aggressive in this area? Part of the reason is because they sit on the periphery of Shanghai. In Shanghai in the late 1990s, and it's the competitive spirit that I'm talking about, decided we don't want those guys, particularly Nanjing, which is further up the river, to have anything to do with the foreign direct investment that we're receiving. So I remember one time I was going to the Shanghai airport in Hongqiao. I was trying to buy plane tickets in Nanjing, and they were just like, no tickets to Nanjing. And I said, well, how about one tomorrow? And they were like, no, you don't understand, we don't fly to Nanjing. It's not happening anymore. So there was like a 2-year period where Shanghai did not fly to Nanjing, and they set these roadblocks on the highways. It was very cool. But what the Jiangsu government did, which is in direct competition, province to province, Jiangsu is a province, Shanghai is a provincial level city, they said, okay, those guys want to play that game? We're going to take this Mayor Zhang, who's a young mayor, up-and-coming star, in Suzhou, We're going to broker a relationship between him and the Singaporean government. We're going to help him get a $9 billion investment. And we're going to build a Singapore Suzhou industrial park that is going to be the best place to do business in the world. And when you talk to managers who work in there, so I'm talking foreign direct investors who have decided to locate in Suzhou, which for a while became the #1 destination of foreign direct investment in China, they will tell you that this is not just the best place to work in China. It is the most efficient place to work in the world. And so then, when a place like this starts investing in renewable energy and in solar technology, there's no stopping them. Now, I also want to mention a couple of other things that I think are key to this. I mentioned a few minutes ago the State-Owned Asset Administration, State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, which is, in a hidden way, the main shareholder of English Solar. But SASIC is everywhere in China. So there's a central SASIC, which is basically broke off from the Ministry of Finance and became an asset manager. And it is the major shareholder in every blue chip company coming out of China, with the exception of a few of the privates. Right, so every one of the blue chip companies that comes from the state sector, PetroChina, Ingli, all of the ones that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, these all are majority owned by SASIC. Now this has made some investors nervous, but investors who actually spend time sitting down with the SASIC people, they get that these guys understand doing business, but they not only understand doing business, they understand cross-industry coordination, they understand macro-level strategizing for industries, and they have a very, very strong lobby with the government. So people like Warren Buffett, who became a major co-investor with SASIC when he bought 10% of PetroChina's shares at that IPO, I think really makes this point. And so I also just finally want to mention this issue of cross-industry strategization. Cross-industry strategizing is something that we used to do in this country quite a bit. There used to be, even here in Washington, D.C., the Federal City Council used to play this kind of role, where people would actually sit down together from across industries and think, what are we actually doing to create what we would today disparagingly call China Inc. Right? We think about China Inc. and it makes everyone mad. I've had enough executives from the oil industry in my classes who will say, the whole thing is so unfair because we're competing for contracts in Africa and China is coming in there with oil and airlines, and hotels, and everything else, and how can we compete? And to my mind, I think, well, maybe we should start having more cross-industry coordination. Maybe that would actually be a better, more attractive package. The final issue that's so crucial here, though, is partnerships with foreign direct investment. Now, China makes no bones about it, and I know many people are very concerned with the loss of intellectual property rights. And it is definitely something to be concerned about, although from China's perspective, they're quite clear on the quid pro quo here. The basic position is you want access to our market, you're going to make money, but you're also going to turn the technology over to us eventually. And so, their view with companies like Motorola and Cisco and others has been, look, if you don't want to play that game, that's fine. You don't have to have access to our internal markets. Now, that changed a little bit after 2001 because of the WTO accession. Many people still think their position on it in terms of procurement is quite unfair. And I think that's a debatable point. I think it may be. But that's sort of their position on these issues. But if you look at companies who have cracked the nut on this, companies like Intel, companies like IBM, their position has been, we know that our IPR is going to go out the door. But what we also know is that there is an incredible dynamism that's happening here. And we actually want to be a part of that dynamism. As long as we stay 2 steps ahead in terms of our intellectual property development, we're going to be fine. And so I think that there's something that's very important there that has to do with questions of foreign direct investment. But the second piece of foreign direct investment that is my particular hobby horse right now is that if we can't figure out how to open our economy up to foreign direct investment coming back, we may as well give up. Because this is actually, we've seen this show before. In the 1980s, Japan was sitting on a tremendous amount of treasuries, a tremendous amount of our debt, but also a tremendous amount of cash. And they were looking for places to put that cash. Now, they did build some plants, some Subaru plants and some Toyota plants in the Midwest. They bought Pebble Beach. But for the most part, I remember that time as the U.S. reacting very negatively culturally to the idea that Japan would be coming in here and co-owning business with us. We're in that space again today. Occasionally, a major moment, a major opportunity will come up in which China wants to buy, say, Unicom, the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, put in a bid to buy Unicom in 2005. Congress stepped in and said, can't do it. We can't allow that to happen because it's a national security issue. We can't have a Chinese company, state-owned company, owning our oil companies. Okay, fair enough. But then Haier wanted to buy Maytag. Right? Our washing machine was security risk? I'm not sure what the... Now that deal actually never got to an official congressional quashing of the deal, but it was threatened, and they left. Now Haier is a company that has become successful in the U.S. precisely because they invested $40 million in an R&D facility in North Carolina. Essentially, I'm guessing doing so to quell Jesse Helms, the late Senator Jesse Helms' concerns about China. But we're sitting in this moment again today. Think about the Huawei attempt to buy Freedom. This was a $2 million deal to basically buy some positions that would allow them procurement opportunities in the United States. It had very little to do with technology. Now, Huawei has been in trouble in lawsuits with both Cisco and Motorola, both of which have been settled by now. And there's concerns about Huawei because it's not a publicly traded company, and so the transparency is less than most publicly traded companies. But the question that is before us, first of all, Huawei has basically said, we will open our books. We will do it. Whatever you want to see from us, we will make it transparent to you because we want to be partners with the United States. The United States is basically saying, no, we don't actually want you. Now, my fear is that how many times can we turn away the largest cash, the largest amount of cash that's in the world, the Chinese are sitting on it. And the only way to rebuild jobs in this country is to actually attract that capital back here. Eventually, that capital is going to go to Europe. Right? Eventually, they will get frustrated and they won't stay here. And so I think that that's a major issue about foreign investment. Now, the interesting thing to me is that we built industries this way before. We led the world in doing it. We had the greatest auto industry in the world for decades precisely because of governmental leadership, cross-industry strategization, and basically investment, hidden investment in this case because the government built all the roads. But this is actually a case where we know how to do this very well, but I think we've lost our way. And unfortunately, we've lost our way at a time when we need innovation from new industries. We need to actually, the amazing thing about this industry is that we sit on most of the technology. The technology comes from here. It's GE, UConn, but they have a much easier time actually building things in China. There's one other piece to the more friendly business environment, which is not really an area of my own research because it has to do with education. But the other thing that I often hear from people that are making decisions to leave for China is that our skilled labor force has been decimated in this country by the lack of investment in vocational education. And so I just over and over have these conversations with American managers and mid-cap companies that are leaving for China and convinced that it's going to be more expensive for them. And so I'll say, well, why would you go? And so, well, for one thing, GE and GM are telling us we have to go. Two, there's a big market there. But three, there's more skilled labor. And so I just, all of those things sort of flow together to make me think that we have a lot of work to do. So let me just summarize my comments here by just saying I think that the first thing is that I think we need to, as a country, really think deeply about how to develop new industries. Renewable technology and solar, I think, are one of the keys that are most interesting in this space. But we need to be clear, in my view, that the free market cannot do it by itself. Almost every major innovation, forget about automobiles, the internet was a DARPA project, right? But everything that has changed the world today has come out of that kind of investment because you can have stable investment with strong resources. But I also want to emphasize here that China is a place of radical institutional change. It is a place in which it's not just a question of heavy investment in cheap labor, but it's actually a question in innovation in terms of how to develop economies. In the case of Suzhou, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, here is an organization called the Suzhou Industrial Park Commission. They actually are preparing right now a public offering on the Singaporean Stock Exchange, which is a very interesting model of development because they are a state-run model and a planning commission. But they decided that actually they're doing so well in terms of real estate and economic development that they should actually and have a public-private partnership. So those models, when you're not blocked by the notion that governments are bad and markets are good, you actually have a lot more opportunity to do radical things. And that's the kind of stuff we're seeing in China today. And so I'll just end my comments right there, and we have a couple minutes for questions as well. Thank you.